Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. On the panel, joining via Zoom with me today is Ms. Tracy Anderson and Ms. Lynn Nesbitt. Our assessor today is Mr. Nathan Kupfer, also joining via Zoom. Our secretary today is Ms. Crystal Harland. And my name is Bill Moretsky. I am also on the panel and will be chairing this hearing. To the Zoom participants of the hearing, please note you are placed in the waiting room until your property is called upon. When it is your turn, you will be admitted into the meeting. Kindly follow along on the City of Winnipeg's Board of Revision YouTube channel for the hearing process. Once the host admits you into the hearing, please close or mute your YouTube player. You will then be permitted to speak with respect to your property. Once your hearing has concluded, you can leave the meeting. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included in the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony, followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will hear items 1 through 7 on our docket today. Mr. Mohan, please affirm the assessors and the applicant's testimony for the first property on our docket.
Of course, Mr. Chair. Mr. Assessor, please state your full name.
Nathan Kupfer.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Carson Horsburgh.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our first property on the docket today is 1177, item number 1177 Portage Avenue. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is file number 24-723. The roll number is 130-116-63100, and the street address is 1177 Portage Avenue. The owner of this property is Belgian Alliance Credit Union. They are both the owners and the occupiers of 1177 Portage. This is a credit union. We have it as a commercial bank. We group credit unions and banks together, so you'll see that property type class for all of the properties that we'll be discussing on the docket today. As you can see, this was constructed in 2005, so it is a newer building. It has ample land area here, just under 23,000 square feet, and a leasable area of 5,684 square feet spread out over 2 floors. We have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $2,243,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Scrolling to page 2 of my brief, you can see the subject sale history and some photos that I've included of the subject property. As you can see, the last sale was in 2005, prior to the construction of the credit union. So this $462,000 represents a land sale. You can see underneath that the parcel, which I'm referring to. So this is right on the corner of Portage and Wall Street. Good visibility, ample parking, multiple entrances. Scrolling down to page 3, you can see the Google Street View photos that I've plucked off of Google. In my opinion, the bank shows quite well. No deficiencies or anything observable really from the outset, and you can see the division there between the first floor and second floor. The second floor isn't quite as big as the first. Scrolling to page 4 of my brief, I've included my rent comparables. All of these are either banks or credit unions. I've included the same 12 comparables for all of the properties that we'll be dealing with today, so there's no picking and choosing here. I've included banks and credit unions from all over the city, with a low ranging of about $18 to a high of about $47. So again, I'm expressing a wide range to show both ends of the comparable list here, both the high end and the low end, some larger, some smaller, some newer, and some older. As I've stated, I believe this bank or this credit union is both newer and fairly well located. Scrolling to page 5 of my brief, this is the income value workup for this property. All the properties that we'll be discussing today have been assessed using the income method. So we have a breakdown of the tenant class here. This is actually a breakdown between the 2 floors. So the larger floor, the first line here, 3,562 square feet. This represents the first floor, and we have this modeled as bank area with a modeled rate of $33.54. And then the second line, the C2 standard finish, pertains to the second floor area, with a lower rate being assigned by our model of only $24.22. These two rates taken over the total space would be $170,864 of potential rent over the 5,684 square feet, is just over $30, $30 and a cent, rounded off would be the blended rent. All of this is model driven, including the other parameters here: 2% vacancy loss, 3% for expenses, an $8 shortfall rate, and a 7.2% capitalization rate is how we derive our value of $2,243,000. Scrolling to page 6 of my brief, this is the income value summary. So there's only one stream, one classification for this property, so it's all straightforward, virtually the same as you would have seen on page 5, totaling our assessed value of $2,243,000. Page 7 is our capitalization rate table. This is included essentially all of our income briefs here. You'll notice that banks aren't a specific category, which is reported or tracked by these institutions, Colliers, CBRE, and Cushman Wakefield. They don't release bank capitalization rates for Winnipeg. In my opinion, a bank is effectively a subset of an office, suburban office. So I would recommend using the suburban A and B rates within this table to guide our capitalization rates today. This property being a newer one and a fairly well located one, I believe would fall closer to the suburban A category. Page 8 of my brief includes some Municipal Assessment Act excerpts regarding burden of proof and requesting information. Again, this property is within compliance, so none of that is going to be an issue for this brief. And then pages 9 and 10, I've included the income and expense information as submitted by the property owner. Again, owner-occupied property, so we have no site-specific NOI to compare to see how our model is generating comparatively. So based on that, we're reliant on comparables. Again, the comparable table, which I've provided on page 4, I believe supports our modeled rates quite well. Again, given the age, size, and location of this credit union, I believe the assessment being produced by our model is a fair one, and I'm going to recommend that our 2025 assessment be confirmed at $2,243,000. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Mr. Horsberg, do you have any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one or two questions for the assessor. My pen. Just with regard to, just with regard to page 5 of the disclosure, just with the two different rental rates, the C2 under tenant class, Mr. Cupford, does that correspond with a office rental rate?
It doesn't quite go by office or by bank. The C2 is a bit of a standalone within our model, but I believe it's well supported by what our comparable tables show.
Okay. And then so the two different rates, one being for the main floor and one being for the second floor.
Yes, sir. I think we can agree that generally second floor rents are going to demand a bit of a less of a premium than the first floor, and our model is reflecting that.
Okay. And then on page 4, the rental comparables, are you aware of which of these have a second floor, if any of them?
Yes, so comparable number 6 is indicated to be 2 stories. Comparables 11 and 12 as well would also be 2 floors. The rest are just single story.
Okay. So number 6, 11, and 12 being 2
Yes,
story.
sir. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. No further questions. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, do you have any questions for the assessor?
I do not, thank you.
Ms. Nesbitt, do you have any questions for the assessor?
I do. Just also looking at your page 4, Mr. For your rent comparables. And I'm also looking at the 2-story comparables. There's quite a range of rents there. So I'm questioning, there's an $18 rent, a $42 rent, and a $23 rent. So are those second floor rents? Are they first floor rents? Is it a blended rent? Like what are those rents?
That would be the rent for both spaces, so all encompassing. So I think it stands to reason that an all-encompassing rent for a 2-story property is going to average out to be lower than one that's only a single story, because that second floor is dragging down the rent a little bit. With regards to comparable 11, I think largely the high rent there is due to it being effectively a brand new building, less so than the fact that it's 2 stories. It's constructed in 2017, and it's quite a nice building.
Okay, so I see what you're saying. The comp 6 and comp 12 do have on the lower end 18 then and 23. You're speaking that would be like a blended rent, right?
That's correct.
Okay. The subject property we're talking about today has a blended rent of $30 then, which is quite a bit higher than these comps blended rent. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think it touches closer to comparable 11, largely based on how much newer of a building it is, being constructed
Okay.
in 2005. I'd
Mhm.
also point out that it is quite well located, and the comparable number 12 was only on a 1-year lease, which might be part of the reason the net rate is a little bit off with the rest of the comparables table. Generally, we're going for 3 to 5 or 10-year leases, and they tend to be a bit more stable.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Cupfer. No additional questions, Mr. Chair.
So why is the bank rent high for a bank? Why is it high for a bank? Or do you agree first that it's higher than normal office rent?
Banks certainly, on average, rent for more than offices.
Why is that?
Largely because of how they're constructed and how well they're maintained, is my understanding. Banks will have certain construction requirements regarding safety, security, and other things that offices generally aren't subject to. And I think the largest factor is that banks are constantly being renovated to have newer, nicer finishings. Nobody wants to bank at a shabby looking bank, essentially. So they are all generally top of the line, very nicely finished properties. So I think for those reasons, in general, we see higher rents constantly being reported by the banks and credit unions over standard offices.
Okay, and then you determined that particular structure constructed that way can be rented out on the market as a bank then? Is that how you
The
assess
subject
it?
property, yes, it was constructed as a credit union to the best of my knowledge back in 2005. It's been a credit union the whole time. Yeah, that's the usage.
There's $91,000, or sorry, if you can go to page to 9. There's a little over $91,000 of expenses that the owner incurred. These would normally be recoverable expenses, would that be correct?
It would depend if it was a net or gross lease, but generally speaking, yes, these expenses could be recoverable.
Okay, and you have a shortfall of $8 per square foot. So if I work out the expenses divided by the area, it comes out $16 a square foot.
Yes. Well, the $8 shortfall is probably low. It's standardized by our model. In reality, a property that rents for more has a higher rent, would also have a higher shortfall. Yeah, these are our model parameters.
But your model doesn't capture that though. That would be higher.
No, it doesn't increase the shortfall based on the modeled rents. No, it's just standardized for the property type class.
Okay. I have no further questions then. Mr. Hornberg, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as we were just discussing, the subject property is 1177 Portage Avenue. If the board will follow me to page 3 of the disclosure, the assessed value is $2,243,000. MNP has valued the subject property and determined a market value of $1,713,000. And our determination of that value is mostly due to the potential income. We're not disputing the vacancy allowance, expense allowance, or capitalization rate. However, as we saw with the range of rents that banks can achieve in Winnipeg, we didn't feel that the market rent or the model derived rent was suitable for the subject property. And I'll speak to the rental analysis later on, but we've determined that an appropriate market rent for the subject property would be $23 a square foot. So page 5 has MNP's valuation of the property. Page 6 has the assessment department's valuation of the property. And moving on to pages 7 and 8, we have assessment map, aerial photograph, and exterior photographs as well on page 9. Moving on to page 10, MNP has analyzed a number of bank leases as well. Some of these properties you'll see on the table on page 10 have been used by the city as well. So here's the main thing with the rental rate for the property. So both the assessor and I have looked at a lot of similar properties, some of the exact same properties. What you'll notice is that the bank properties in Winnipeg that are achieving these over $25 a square foot rates, these $30 square foot rates, all of these properties are either located at a shopping center or adjacent from a shopping center. So if we look at, for example, some of these banks on St. Mary's, they're right by St. Vital Mall, and they're getting $24 a square foot, $20 a square foot. Grant Avenue, again across the street from Grant Park Mall, getting $30 a square foot. single-story bank leases as well, I should note, save for 230 Portage, which is a downtown bank, 2-floor, $18 a square foot. Was also included in the assessor's brief. But the main point I want to make is that the properties, again, knowing that it's a model-derived rent, something in the model is jacking up the price of market rents as it pertains to the city assessment model. Something is increasing these rents. And it's because there are high rents for banks in certain areas. If you're renting space that's right by a major shopping center, you're going to get a higher rent. The subject property being standalone on Portage Avenue isn't going to be able to achieve what a bank that's right by St. Vital Mall can achieve. If we move on to page 11, it's also important to note that modern banks aren't the same as our older banks. No longer are new banks built with a vault, safety deposit boxes. Everything's gone online for banks. And you've seen in Winnipeg driving around, the footprint of banks has shrunk over the years. We see fewer standalone banks. We see more banks in strip malls and that sort of thing, because banks don't need that sort of infrastructure anymore. And again, the properties that the banks that can achieve these high rents, $30 rents, they're the ones that are close to shopping centers and that sort of a thing. So now on pages 12 through, I believe, 17, I've got photographs of the comparables that we've looked at for rents. On page 18, I've included a map just showing where these properties are located. And I also felt that it was important to note, and this is on page 19, what properties, what kind of rents are achieved on that part of Portage. So like what are neighboring retail and office buildings achieving for rents? And so I've included that on page 19. We can see just next door, $12 a square foot, $16 a square foot, $17 a square foot, $10 a square foot, $13 a square foot, all for similar office or retail type properties. So now finishing up here on page 20, again, the subject property being located where it is, it's not able, its position in the market is not such that it can achieve the rental rate that it's been assessed with. The market evidence would point towards a market rent for this property of $23 a square foot, and that's what M&P has based our valuation on. And respectfully, I would ask the board to revise the assessment to reflect the fair market value. And with that, I would welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Good. Mr. Kupfer, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
Just a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horsbrough, I am looking at your page 10 here, the rent comparable table. I suppose this is our main issue of contention, is you're not disputing the capitalization rate or any of the other parameters, correct?
That's correct. I think it's just a matter of what's the right rent.
Okay. And you've selected $23 a foot to represent this property, correct?
Yeah, that's the median from these rent comparables.
The median from these comparables, okay. This is a newer building, this credit union, correct? 2005 construction?
Yeah, it's getting up on 20 years old.
Okay. So I'm looking at your comparables table for properties which were built within a similar time frame here. And I guess I'm looking at 4 properties that were built within 10 years of the subject property. 900 Harrow Street East, which is also on my table. That one's $23 a foot. And that one's the 1-year lease. And then the bottom 3 properties here, 2785 Pembina at $33 a foot, 270 St. Anne's at $36.70, and 2799 Pembina at $30.50. So would you agree with me that there's a correlation here between newer buildings achieving higher rents?
No, I think it's a correlation between location more so than anything. I think we both pointed to some of these properties that are newer and south on Pembina, which is a higher income neighborhood in Winnipeg as opposed to the West End. So it's an attractive location, and they're able to achieve higher rents as a result.
Okay. You've noted which properties have drive-throughs. Does the subject property, to your knowledge, have a drive-through ATM?
I believe it does.
Okay. This is also generally considered a positive attribute, correct?
I would agree, yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
My questions have been asked and answered. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Just one, I think, if I recall correctly, you said that if it has a drive-through, it has a better value. And can you tell me the same comparison if there is a standalone versus involved in a strip mall, which has the higher value? I can see by the rents, but just in your opinion.
Yeah, in my opinion, I mean, I look at Winnipeg, we're a winter city, and I hate to admit it, but I use the drive-through at the bank. I know I could just get in. So overall, I'd say it's a positive, and in theory, you should be able to get a higher rent with a drive-through.
Okay, thank you. That's it, Mr. Chair.
So those last three properties on your page 10 there, they're getting $30 to $36 or $37 a square foot. So your main argument for why this subject property would be lower rent and inferior to those three properties is because of the location? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's right. Like looking at those three located in St. Vital or south on Pembina, I mean, banks have to kind of operate where the money is. So of course, in a wealthier neighborhood, you're going to be able to achieve a higher rent than you would in the West End, and that kind of goes for all property types.
Why are you saying that? Why is the wealth a part of the equation here?
Well,
Wealth of the neighborhood?
well, banks want to operate where their customers are at the end of the day. So if you know this is where your customers are, you have wealthy suburban area, the market in general, you're going to be able to achieve higher rents.
Okay. I have no further questions then. Anything in summation, Mr. Cupford?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
And Mr. Forsberg, any questions?
No desire for summation. Thank you.
Okay, that then will complete item 11177 Portage. Now, can you maybe tell or Newman that we're probably gonna be ready in about 20 minutes here? So,
Yes, I can tell him that.
okay, we do have a non-co-op, but
Okay,
it'll take 20 minutes probably.
all right. Mr. Chair, would you please ask Mr. Horsberg if he's going to be doing item 2? I thought it was going to be Wesley Van Bruggen.
Okay, Mr. Horsberg, are you gonna do item 2?
I'm going to do item 2 as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
335B. Okay, then we will go on to item number 2, 335 Main Street. And Mr. Cupfer, there is some preliminary issue here with on co-op, is that correct?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry to interrupt, but for some reason, I do not have an item 2 in my drive.
Okay, Mr. Chair, just a second, I'll check on that.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Mr. Chair, would you please tell Ms. Anderson that if she just refreshes her drive, then she should have an item 2.
Okay,
I heard that.
I can hear you. And
All
yes,
right.
I have it. Thank you very much. We're good to go now.
Thank you.
all right. Okay, so just continuing, Mr. Kupfer, you have, I believe there's a preliminary issue, you're seeking non-co-op on this property?
The city is seeking non-cooperation on this property. We haven't been receiving income and expense reporting since the sale, actually, in 2020. So I wasn't able to find any returned INEs for 2021, 22, or 23. And I've included the signed Canada Post mailing information as pages 10 and 11 of my brief. So based on that, we are going to request that the burden of proof be shifted to the applicant and non-cooperation be applied.
Okay, can you then read in the property and do you want to continue on with more on the non-co-op then?
That's it for the non-co-op, but for the record, this is file number 24-920, and the roll number is 120-938-23000 with the street address of 335 Main Street.
Mr. Horsberg, do you have any questions with respect to the non-co-op?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I object to the application for non-cooperation. The subject property today is the old Bank of Montreal at the corner of Portage and Main. It's been in the news over the last couple of years. It was acquired by the Métis Federation, and they're turning it into a museum. So the property's been vacant. So the city's been sending the mailers, and there's nothing to report. So I don't feel that this is an appropriate occasion to grant the penalties that come with non-cooperation.
Ms. Nesbitt, do you have any questions on the non-co-op?
I have no questions for Mr. Kupfer. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, do you have any questions on the non-co-op?
Also, no questions. Thank you.
So what was your, this question is for Mr. Horsberg. You're asserting that the new owners would not have had a chance to do the mailers, is that what you're saying?
Yes, I'm saying they took ownership of the property and it's been vacant. It's being converted into a museum. So there was no.
So why does that mean they can't do the mailers?
There's no information to be provided.
Could they have responded though? Yeah.
I believe it would have been better if they had responded. However, it is quite a significant penalty to impose on a property, on an organization that's invested in our downtown and in creating saving a vacant building, really. So it's my opinion. I know ideally they should have filled out the form and just said, hey, we don't have any information, but it's a unique property and they own dozens of properties and they've been compliant with every other property that they own. So I would just ask for a little bit of discretion and some clemency for this property and some sympathy from the board in that regard.
Okay, let's break for recess and we'll deliberate on the non-co-op issue. Okay, we're back in order and the board has considered the city's request of non-cooperation on this property and we have decided to grant it. So Mr. Kupfer, you may carry on with your presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, street address is 335 Main Street. The current owners, the Manitoba Métis Federation. This is, as Mr. Horsburgh pointed out, a former Bank of Montreal location. You can see we still have the parcel use code as commercial bank. This building is 4 stories, originally constructed in 1910. We have an effective age on file of 1960, reflecting some fairly significant renovations that have taken place in the past. The leasable area for this building is 38,458 square feet, spread out over those 4 stories, as well as some basement space. We have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $7,366,000 that I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Scrolling to page 2 of my brief, you can see the subject sale history as well as some photos. So the property did transact in August of 2020 for $5 million even between BMO and the Manitoba Métis Federation. So that was the sale price. And then page 3 of my brief, you can see the street view photo. Again, this property is located effectively right at the confluence of Portage and Main. So it is quite well located downtown. Scrolling to page 5 of my brief, I've provided all the same rent comparables as I did for the previous property, as I will be doing throughout the day today. So again, high end and low end, you get a range here, newer buildings, older buildings, a bit of everything for consideration. Page 6 of my brief has the income value workup. So again, we are still assessing this as a bank. So we have 33,160 square feet being assessed as bank space at $18.55. And then we have finished basement space. This is the C6 storage mezzanine space of just over 5,000 square feet at a lower rate of just under $8 a foot. Everything else here, as I stated, is model driven, including the vacancy, expenses, and shortfall. As you can see, it still has an $8 shortfall, despite the rent being almost half of what the last property was that we discussed. And the models put out a fairly high capitalization rate for this property at 8.4%, which I think is largely reflective of the age, the original age of construction being 1910. I think would be a driver in our model pushing that capitalization rate up. And that is how we achieve the value of $7,366,000. Scrolling to page 7 of my brief, you can see the income value summary. Again, same with the last property. There's only one classification on here, so it's all straightforward, only one income stream. So it's all the same values and parameters as you saw on page 6, same on page 7. Nothing new to say really about the capitalization rates or the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts, except what I've already reiterated here about bank and credit union properties not having a specific subclass being reported, but in my opinion fall most closely into the suburban office class. Pages 10 and 11 pertain to the non-compliance requests, which we've covered. And then beginning on page 12, I've included some of the permit work currently being conducted within the building. So this is all work that's either has been finished or is in the process of being carried out. I've included 2 major permits here, which I was able to pull for the subject site, totaling approximately $2.25 million. My understanding is much of this work is still ongoing. And I've included some printouts showing when they were issued and the approximate valuation of the permits. So we don't have full information on the property yet, as Mr. Horsborough mentioned. It is actively being converted from a former bank into something else. Other than some news reports, I don't have a lot to go on what that final configuration will look like. So at this time, it is still being modeled as a bank until we get new occupancy permits and a clearer picture of what's happening there. So based on that, based on the sale price and the permits that have been pulled and all the information I have about the property, I am going to recommend that assessment be confirmed at $7,366,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Horsberg, any question on the assessor's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple quick questions. Mr. Kupfer, you would agree the property is no longer functioning as a bank?
To the best of my knowledge, it is no longer a bank, yes.
And the property, the model derived rent, that's a bank rent?
It is, yes.
Thank you. And then on page 5, the rent comparables, I'll note 230 Portage is the downtown is located downtown, or any of these other rent comparables at downtown banks?
I would only consider 230 Portage. I would agree with you there. Those are the two downtown banks.
And would you agree that on a square footage basis, 230 Portage is significantly smaller than the subject?
Yeah, 230 Portage is just under 10,000 square feet. This one's up around 35,000.
Okay, and that property was achieving $18 per square foot of rent, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then just on pages 13 and 14, starting on page 13, we have end date April 16th, 2024. Is that right?
That's right.
And then on page 15, we have issue date September 14th, 2023. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the effective date of assessment is April 1st, 2023. Is that right?
That is right.
Thank you. No further questions.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
Yes, Mr. Kupfer. We know this is not being used as a bank, but did I hear you say that because you don't have information coming from an INE, nothing, you've got nothing for the last 4 years or so, 3 years, you haven't made changes because in the absence of information, you've just kept the model as a bank?
Generally, income and expenses, as well as occupancy permits, are our two biggest factors for
Okay.
switching classifications and updating our information. To my knowledge, there's no new occupancy permit or anything that's been filed, and no income and expenses are being returned. I don't believe we have a recent inspection of the property, so it is still being categorized by its former use as a bank credit union, yes.
Okay, okay. So in the absence of information, you've maintained it as a bank.
Correct.
You've got nothing else to go on.
Correct, yes. It'll be-
Okay.
yes.
Okay, and the rent of 1709, we have the Portage property, which is $18 a square foot. This is 1709 blended rent. What about economies of scale? Would that play in?
It certainly can. I would suggest that economies of scale are weighing down this rent per square foot within our model. A smaller bank, all else being equal, would likely be given a higher rent per square foot. And this is what our models produced for this assessment cycle.
Yeah, you have the main floor at 1855. So that's still 33,000 square feet. So I was just wondering how that then related to the 230 Portage one.
Yeah, 230 Portage is spread out over 2 stories, so we are
Okay.
factoring some of that second floor as well.
Mhm.
And this one, I believe, is 4 stories. So again, this is blended over those multiple stories, which is also another reason why this would be pushed downwards as a rental rate.
Would you have expected it to be even lower?
Not necessarily. If we just plucked it and based it off of this one comparable at 230 Portage, you might be able to reason that that an adjustment downward could be necessitated. But it's just one comparable, so I'm not sure it would be reasonable to make that sort of hard distinction based off of the one lease. I certainly take your point, though.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mr. Kupfer. No additional questions, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Just one about the cap rate. I know that you said that it's model driven, but it just doesn't seem to fall anywhere in the categories of suburban A or B office A or B office classification. So I'm just wondering, can you speak to that a little bit? Where I know model driven, it's a challenge, but it seems really off the charts.
Certainly. I would suggest it's largely to do with the advanced age of the building. An original construction date of 1910, I think, would weigh pretty heavily within our model. And I think that's the primary factor for the elevated capitalization rate of 8.4 outside of the market norms that are reported by the 3 big agencies, as well as our own 20th and 80th percentile reported by the city of Winnipeg. Yeah, I would say it's largely the age.
they're continuing to do renovations in there. And as we've heard today, that banks are continuing, even though this one may or may not be continuing to be used at a bank, as a bank, most banks are continuing to enjoy upkeep, better upkeep than maybe other office buildings. So I'm wondering, again, it's still kind of sticking in the back of my head why. So
Yeah. Well, what will likely happen in the future here is the conversion will be completed, permits will be finalized and issued, occupancy will take place. We'll do an inspection. That effective age of the building will likely be updated again to reflect these new over $2 million of renovations, and then that effective age will likely bring the capitalization rate down from where it's currently being modeled. That's what I suspect will happen here. Yeah, that's about all I have on it.
perfect. Thank you very much for that. And that's it for me, Mr. Chair.
So what is the reason why you included the permits in your presentation?
Well, I included the permits and specifically the permit value as we're lacking income and expense information for the subject property. However, we do have a fairly recent sale. While it's not a concrete methodology, I think it is worth to consider sale price plus cost of construction when looking at the market value.
Okay, but you're assessing it as a bank, but these renovations aren't to upgrade a bank, correct? It's
Correct.
It's to renovate it into something else.
It's to convert and renovate it into something else, correct. More so, we're looking at the total market value of the property, though. And I think the money that's been put into that property, plus the amount that was actually paid, lines up quite well with what we have modeled, despite it being modeled under different parameters, under bank parameters, as you pointed out.
And what was the sale amount again, or where was that?
My page 2. Yeah, 5 million even in the summer of 2020.
Okay, I have no further questions. Okay, Mr. Horsberg, you may begin your presentation.
Mr. Chair, we've lost Nathan on my end here. I don't know. Nathan, are you still there? Mr. Kupfer?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can't see you.
Take off my video.
We can hear you, but we can't see you now.
Okay. Let me try refreshing the video stream.
It might be easier if he just goes with video. Or rather, if he just goes with audio, it'll keep him from freezing.
Can you still hear us?
I can hear you just fine. I haven't changed anything, so I'm not sure why my video dropped on me here.
Okay, well, we'll continue with just audio then. Until you get that, hopefully you can get it figured out on the fly there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with my presentation then.
Okay.
As was just mentioned, we're discussing 335 Main Street, the old Bank of Montreal. The property's been assessed with a value of $7,366,000. MNP has valued the property, and we've determined that the market value amounts to $4,122,000. And there are a number of reasons why that's the case. If the board will follow me to page 6 of the disclosure, we have MNP's income valuation of the property alongside with the city's valuation of the property. We have 2 income streams, the bank income stream and the storage income stream. As we were discussing, the property ceased operating as a bank back in 2019 and subsequently was purchased by the Métis Federation. So it's M&P's opinion that the city has erred in assessing the property as a bank when it has, as of the reference date, it had ceased operating as a bank 4 years prior. So we've used a office rate of $12.50 per square foot, derived from the market from actual rental comparables downtown. And we've assessed it using a storage rate of $6.50 per square foot, coming from storage spaces and leases derived directly from the market. M&P has also disputed the vacancy allowance. It's worth noting the property is 100% vacant. However, of course, we're not asking for it to be valued with that kind of vacancy allowance. However, we are asking that the market vacancy allowance of 12% be applied to this property. Page 7 has the income valuation as provided by assessment and taxation. Page 8 has an assessment map as well as an aerial photograph and more photographs on page 9. If the board will follow me now to page 10, there's some case law that is relevant to this assessment. The Manitoba Court of Appeal ruled on Colony Square versus the Winnipeg City Assessor. And the outcome of that ruling is that properties have to be assessed based on what they might reasonably be expected to sell for on the open market in the applicable reference year. As of the applicable reference date, April 1st, 2023, the property had ceased operating as a bank. And the city's assessment of the property as a bank amounts to a speculative assessment. They're using it's speculation that the property could be used as a bank. You'll see here on page 10 as well, I've included a table of properties nearby on Main Street, all of which were former banks: Bank of British North America, Union Bank, Bank of Toronto, Imperial Bank of Canada, Royal Bank of Canada, Canadian Bank of Commerce, and the Bank of Hamilton, all on Bankers Row here. And none of those properties are assessed as banks. Just because the property was built as a bank back in 1910 doesn't mean it should be assessed as such. And we can see here that of all the old historic downtown banks, none of them are considered to be banks anymore and aren't assessed as such. Considering the property as it is, as of the reference date, it would make the most sense to assess the property as an office building rather than a bank. On page 13, I've also included that the property does have a number of historic protections on it, which limits what can be renovated and what can be changed in the property. And that, again, limits the market for the property as it cannot be demolished and the lot can't be redeveloped to its highest and best use. On page 12, I speak to the vacancy rate that we've asked for. We are asking for a 12% vacancy rate that does fall in line with what actual vacancy was for office buildings in downtown Winnipeg as of the reference date. And I've included the Johnson report, Colliers, and CBRE, all pointing to downtown office vacancy ranging from 10.8% to almost 16%. As well, the graph contained on page 12 does show that as of the first quarter of 2023, the overall vacancy rate for office space in Winnipeg was 14%. Moving on to page 13, we have analyzed a number of office leases in downtown Winnipeg. I have tried to look for larger properties, as the subject property is over 30,000 square feet, and leases for downtown office space of that scale are few and far between. However, I have found a number of larger office buildings that have leased in recent years. As well, I have tried to find older buildings that have since been converted, given the fact that the subject property is well over 100 years old. So looking at these leases, we've determined that a reasonable and appropriate market rent, a rent that the property could realistically achieve if it were to be leased out, would likely fall in the range of about $12.50 a square foot. With regard to the storage space, I wasn't able to find any downtown storage space leases. I'm sure the city would agree that downtown Winnipeg, you're not going to find a lot of larger storage leases. So I have found some storage space leases here, and I've noted that they range from about $5 a square foot to about $6.50 a square foot. So MNP's request of a storage rate of $6.50 per square foot falls in line with what storage space rents for in Winnipeg. Pages 14, 15, and 16 include the photographs of some of the comparable properties that we've based our lease analysis on. If you look on page 14, we have 280 Main Street, which is a 100-year-old building, just close to the subject property. Again, older building that's since been converted. 115 Bannatyne on page 15, a similar type of property, 100-year-old heritage building that's since been renovated and converted. And the same with 136 Market and 65 Rory on page 16, I believe that is, yeah. On page 17, I've just included a map showing where the rental comparables are located in relation to the subject property. I would say that they're all close by, right in downtown Winnipeg. And then on page 18, I just again included MNP's valuation of the subject property based on an office rental rate of $12.50 a square foot, a storage rate of $6.50 a square foot, and a vacancy allowance of 12%, which is typical for office properties in downtown Winnipeg. So again, just to summarize, the property has been assessed as a bank. The property ceased functioning as a bank in 2019 and should not be assessed as a bank. All of the historic banks in Winnipeg no longer function as a bank, and this property does not function as a bank either, and as such should not be assessed as a bank. And with that, I would welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kupfer, any questions on the applicant's presentation, please?
Just a couple. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking at your page 13, Mr. Horsborough, the basement rental rates, and you're correct, we don't have a big sample size of downtown storage rates here. Regarding your sample size, can you speak to whether these are finished or unfinished spaces?
My understanding is that they're, I guess you would call them functionally unfinished. They're mostly warehouses. I wasn't able to pull any storage that office buildings have basements and they lease it out. I'm not aware of that, but they would be finished to the degree that you would expect a warehouse to be finished.
Fair enough. Have you been inside this property? Have you inspected the interior?
Unfortunately not, though I look forward to one day.
Okay. Regarding the sale, the 2020 sale, as you point out in your section in case law, the city of Winnipeg must assess properties based on the amount that the property might reasonably be expected to realize if sold in the open market in the applicable reference year. To the best of your knowledge, was this 2020 sale on the open market and an arm's length sale?
No, not exactly. My understanding is that the bank wanted to get rid of the property. They had been looking for a buyer. I don't know if you really consider it to be a market sale or not. Arm's length. I mean, I haven't read through the offer to purchase. I haven't read through any of those documents, but I wouldn't place a lot of weight on what they purchased it for. You know, that a property like this, it's tricky looking at the sale. looking at the plans and the statements that were released by both parties when the property sold. Both parties admittedly said that they were happy with the price. But is it a market sale? I can't really say one way or another.
Okay, would you agree with me that the two parties were arm's length at least? There's no common ownership between BMO and the Manitoba Métis Federation?
That's correct. As far as I'm aware, I'm not sure if they have a relationship. Who my clients bank with, I'm not sure.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
Yes, I have a question on your $12.50 rent on the office portion, or the area you're designating as the office, the 33,000-ish square feet. You said given size and age, an appropriate rental rate is $12.50. I don't see ages for three of the six, half of the properties, so I'm not sure how you can conclude, or how did you conclude that given the age and the size, there's only one that reaches the size of our subject, and that's the Fort Street one at 1635. No, it's only one comp. I'm not hanging my hat on one comp, but I'm just wondering how you did come to that conclusion, because I'm not drawing that conclusion when I look at this table.
Yeah, no, and that's a fair point. So that 195 Fort on page 14, it's the first photo here. So it probably isn't the best comparable. It's a high security building. So only specialized tenants would go in there who need to be in a high security building. So I wouldn't say it's the best comparable. I would look more at these, 20,000 square foot lease. These are all 15,000 plus square feet. The year of construction, I'm not actually sure where I got that year of construction. Some of them aren't filled out. But on the photographs, we can see here that these are, in the Exchange District, the old historic buildings. But it's rare that you find a lease of that size, 36,000 square feet. And certainly at 1635 a square foot, 3 stories. I certainly don't hang my hat on it either. It's more just to give an idea as to the range of rental rates, that being, a 40-odd-year-old building versus the 100-year-old buildings, like 65 Rory, 136 Market. These are all your historic buildings downtown in the Exchange District.
Would you consider Broadway the Exchange District, or Main Street, the 280 Main?
That's more just your core downtown, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I do not have any more questions that haven't been asked yet, so anything in summation, Mr. Cuthbert?
Nothing from me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything in summation, Mr. Horsberg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a brief summation. So again, I just want to provide just a brief summary. So the old Bank of Montreal property, it's no longer a bank, has been assessed as such. And I would just hope that the board can see that there's a fair solution as to what the property should be assessed at. And respectfully, I would just ask the board to see that this property is assessed as it exists. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That will then conclude that will then conclude this item number 2, 335 Main Street. So we will now be moving to, we have the applicant available.
I will admit, Mr. Newman.
Mr. Chair, could I have a 5-minute break, please?
Okay, we are going to break for a 5-minute recess then. Okay, we are back in order. Our next property on the docket is item 3, 739 Henderson. This is an application for revision of assessed value. And Ms. Harlan, can you please swear in the applicant?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Applicant, would you please state your full name?
Mark Newman?
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, and Mr. Kupfer, you have a rebuttal on this property, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so we are going to go with your main presentation first, and then Mr. Newman's presentation, and then your rebuttal, okay?
Sounds good. This is file number 24-3610. The roll number is 02011366100, and the street address is 739 Henderson Highway. The owner is a Manitoba Limited company, and the tenant is CIBC. So we do have an arm's length lease for this property. This is another bank property. This one is all on one story. Original construction date of 1950, so it is a bit of an older building. The leasable area is 4,976 square feet, including the main floor and the basement. And we have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $1,111,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Page 2 of my brief shows the subject sale history and some photos of the subject property. So this one is located right on the corner of Henderson Highway and Kimberley Avenue. You can see two recent sales for the property, one in 2016 and one in 2017, with the most recent one being for $1,115,550, quite close to what we have modeled here for 2025. Page 3 of my brief shows some Google Street View photos of the property. Like I said, original construction in 1950, but like with most banks, they tend to be quite well maintained. Beginning on page 4 are my rent comparables. Again, haven't made any changes or omissions here. These are the same rent comparables I'll be using all day today. And then beginning on page 5, I have the income value workup here. So as you can see, two different rates being applied, one for the main floor here, the bank area, $22.73, and then a substandard basement rate here of $4.21 for the total valuation there, giving us a potential rent of just under $85,000. Again, all these parameters are model driven. 2% vacancy, 3% expenses, and that $8 shortfall. And in this case, capitalization rate of 7.15% is how we derive this value of $1,111,000. Scrolling to page 6, you can see the income value summary. Like I believe all the properties we'll have on the docket today, there's only one stream, one classification. So that's all straightforward and consistent with what's shown on page 5. Page 7 and 8, again, we have our capitalization rate tables and Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And then beginning on page 9 through to page 10, we have the income and expense information as submitted by the property owners. So for 2022, this income and expense is showing a net operating income for the year to date as $73,514. By contrast, our modeled NOI is $79,468. So our modeled net operating income is about $6,000 higher than what was being reported by the property owner. Fairly close, but admittedly slightly higher. So that's all on the main presentation here. So again, 2025 modeled assessment, $1,111,000, which I believe should be confirmed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Newman, do you have any questions on the assessor's presentation?
I have a few. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Kupfer. As you've noted, it's a 1950 building. If we jump ahead to page 5 for a moment, as you've noted as well, that's entirely model driven. You have comps for the what I'll call the main floor rate. There's no comps for the basement space. City has none in their inventory.
Not many, not enough to make a good sample size every single year. I haven't pulled rates because they would have been from all over the city to come up with this most likely. But I do think $4 for a nominal storage rate based on my knowledge of the market and past properties that I've dealt with is a reasonable one.
And do you think it's typical when a landlord would be leasing a building like this, that they would charge a separate rent for the main floor and a separate rent for the basement? Or is it more likely to simply be, here's the single rate that we'll lease you the building for?
I think it's more likely to be a single merged rent for both of those spaces.
Okay. And if we jump ahead, I think you noted, page 9 and 10 are both the income statement for the property for 2022, and page 10 is the rent roll. And one of the issues we have here is the square footage, but you would agree that the rent roll indicates that the square footage is 4,495 square feet, and that the rent being paid is $16.38, and that's found on page 10 of your brief. That's what it indicates, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Actually, I'm sorry. Can I just, my apologies. Just one more item.
Sure.
Mr. Kupfer, page 4 of your brief, your comparables. So would you agree with me that comparable 7 is the most similar comparable in terms of age and size to the subject?
In terms of age and size, yes, I would say it's a good fit.
And would you agree that comparable 5 is the most similar in terms of age, although admittedly it's substantially larger, but certainly most similar in terms of size? Sorry,
In terms of,
terms of age.
yes, comparable number 5 has an original age of construction of 1952, and the subject is 1950, so that would be the closest in terms of age.
Right. Okay, and the rents there are 1874 and 1983, and yet the model is generating $22.73, correct?
That's correct.
All right, those are my questions. Truly, finally, thank you.
Okay, I did have a question regarding the, just one moment, I've lost myself here. Actually, at this time, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
Yes, I did have a question. So, Mr. Kupfer, I'm trying to make the math work, and you have a total square footage of 4,976. 3,400 of that ish is that main floor, right? What do you attribute the difference in square foot to between what you're using in the model and what's on the I&E?
If I'm remembering correctly, because I dealt with this actually at the last cycle and we had the same issue, the difference had to do with the way that the space was measured. The measurements that were supplied by the agent at that last hearing, if I'm remembering correctly, were interior measurements, and the city, as well as just the standard throughout Manitoba, is to use exterior measurements for the space. So using exterior measurements, I believe our area of 4,976 is correct. I understand the property owners or the agent have acquired measurements from an Ontario-based company, and they came out with a different set of numbers. So that's what they're using on their I&E.
Okay, so it's just a difference in how it's being done.
I believe so.
Okay. Okay. I think that was my only question. Thank you.
And how did you arrive at your cap rate of 7.15%, Mr. Kupfer?
Well, it's model driven, but like most of these, it's generally a factor of the age, size, and location of the property. And that's how the model would have selected the 7.15%.
And where would it fit on the chart on page 7?
I believe it would fall into the suburban office category, either suburban office A or suburban office B.
Okay, so it's a little higher than the 80th percentile because of the age. That
I would suggest so, yeah, largely because of the age. Yeah.
Okay. No further questions.
Mr. Chair, could I ask another question? Sorry.
Sure.
Mr. Kupfer, does this bank have a drive-through ATM?
I don't believe that they do, largely because it's a smaller lot, so there wouldn't really be room to put one, and it's also older. I think the drive-through ATMs are largely a newer convention that newer banks and credit unions are building. I don't believe this has one.
Okay. And just one more, if you'll indulge me. We heard on another property about a 7.2 cap rate for a new building and newer building. This is a little bit smaller, but it's certainly much older. And the cap rate's very similar. Can you explain that?
I can't really explain why it might be modeled differently from a different properties model. In my opinion, in looking at this, I think both of those would probably be on the higher end in the 7%. But that's what our model is kicked out. I haven't applied for an increase or asked for a lower capitalization rate. Simply here to defend what we presented.
No, fair enough. I just thought maybe you could give me an explanation. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And we'll complete questioning on the assessor's presentation then. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you. So I think what will be clear is the issues we have here are the rental rate, the square footage, and ultimately the capitalization rate as well. I think, well, let me just work through my brief as it's written. Page 2 identifies the issues on the square footage rate. I hear what the assessor says, and I'll show you in a couple of moments the measurements at the back of the brief. But perhaps more importantly is this is what the parties have agreed to. The rent roll is in the assessor's brief. It's in my brief as well. It shows 4,495 square feet. It shows a rate of $16.38 a square foot. I appreciate that the model kicks out both a main floor rate and a basement rate, but as the assessor has acknowledged, the parties would likely negotiate simply a single rate for the entirety of the building, and that's what's happened in this case, and it's based on 4,495 square feet. So when the owner goes to sell, and if the owner is going to sell this lease, for example, then what the owner is selling is an income stream based on 4,495 square feet and not 4,900 plus square feet. So I'm going to ask you to consider adjusting the square footage. If you go to page 3 of my brief, I mentioned there that the actual rent is $16.38. I give you some comparables, and without question, and the assessor's got a spectrum of rents in his comparables. As he's acknowledged, the best comparables were 5 and 7, and those comparables were a building on Marion, and as well the building on 1300 Pembina. They were the oldest. One of them very similar in size, the other one a bit bigger. Bank rents can be all over the map, but one thing I will say is that when you get the older branches, you tend to find some lower rents. And this is what we're seeing on my list of rents there. And this is what we see in the assessor's brief as well with comps 5 and 7. And my point simply is that the assessor's rent of $16.97 or 94 cents a square foot, his blended rate, is being brought up by what I think is too high a rate at the $22.73 for the main floor. If you simply looked at a single rate, you're seeing lower rates for what I'll call older branches. There's some suburban office rent shown there as well. I'll speak in a moment about whether this should or should not be office, but I've referenced office rates. The vacancy. So there's two things happening here. One, you've got 30% of the space in the basement, and I'm going to talk about that in the context of the capitalization rate. I think that's a risk factor from a capitalization rate perspective. If an investor looks at a property that's got 30% of its leasable area in the basement, that's less than ideal. It's not as good as properties that won't have that. And I dare say that the model is undoubtedly dealing with premises that are primarily, substantially single floor premises without basement space. The other reason, the other thing that's going on with banks is the number of them is diminishing. It's reducing. And I mention here at page 3 and on to page 4, I talk about the number of banks. It's diminishing. I talk about technology and what it's doing to banks. And I'll take you through some documents, some data from banking sources that speaks to that. But what the point I'm coming to ultimately is demand for bank premises is reducing. So I treated this as retail, but I don't think it necessarily matters. There was a question asked about a drive-through. There's no room on this site. You'll see the photos I'll show you, but there simply is no room on this site for drive-through. So I treated it as retail, and again, I don't want to belabor this, but the starting point is that, if you're going to compare it, for example, to a strip center, strip centers are primarily of two types. The anchored, they have a drugstore, they have a food store, or the non-anchored, which don't have those things. And the non-anchored are always less favored, less valuable than the anchored. As we get to April 1 of 2023, we've had a lot happen in the world. We've had COVID. We've had the impacts of it. We've had all the uncertainty that comes out of that. Never mind the online shopping stuff. The capitalization rates from the brokers, you can see them. They're laid out on page 8. That's really a repetition of the assessor's chart. I will circle back to that. At page 9, I reference a study that Altus has published about retail capitalization rates, and I note their analysis at the chart on page 10 and their view of the world as to where the properties fall in the spectrum. And so, top quality, which would be the grocery or drug anchored, are going to be 6.5 to 7. But then we're going to get to what they call standard quality or low quality, 7 to 7.5, 7.5 to 8.5. I would put this into what I'll call a standard quality, but I would put it at the high end of the range considering its age primarily. Page 12, a reference to interest rates. We all know that interest rates moved up significantly as we came to April 1 of 2023. The chart on page 13 shows you the increases to the bank rate. Why do I tell you this when we ignore debt service and calculating value? Because reality is that debt service influences capitalization rates. When interest rates are going up, capitalization rates are going up. And the reality is debt is the engine that drives the real estate economy. When interest rates go up, the real estate economy slows down, and cap rates go up and values come down. So let's jump ahead then to page 15. Some factors to consider in the context of the capitalization rate. It's a small site, 5,103 square feet. The building plan area is 3,428 square feet. There's 4 stalls visible at the rear of the property. I'll show you that in a moment. As I say on page 16, first bullet, under the Altus classification, it would be 7 to 7.5 as a low quality, as a standard quality, higher as a low quality. In this case, the high percentage of leasable area in the basement, from my perspective, increases the risk factor and the attractiveness, or decreases the attractiveness of the property in the market. Also, let's have in mind the property is 75 years old. It was built in 1950. There's a trend with banks to ongoing closures and mergers. I'm going to show you some more data about that. Here we've got a lease expiring November 30 of 26. And yes, that's 3.5 years away from the reference date. But having said that, banks don't stay forever as they once did. A lot of branches have closed in a lot of places. They get consolidated into larger branches, and they get consolidated into more efficient branches. So I'm using what I've done is I've used the rent in place and the certified square footage. That creates potential income of $73,628. Applying all the variables brings the net operating income to $69,271. It's a $4,000 difference approximately. As the assessor noted, his net operating income is $79,468. I apply a 7.5 capitalization rate, and that brings a value of $923,000. Let's look at some of the remaining attachments. Page 17, you can see an overhead of the property, and you can see the small rectangular site. A lower photo on page 17 allows you to see the rear of the site and what appear to be 4 parking stalls. Another view at page 18. Then we get into some data from banks. And the theme of all this is that the number of bank branches is diminishing. We see on page 19, and it's happening around the world, but we see data for Canada comparing 2012 with 2022, 9% down in terms of bank branches. We see per capita bank branches in Canada, it's come down by 15% over those 9 years. Lower half of page 20, credit union mergers. Again, lots of mergers going on, all to the point that the number of branches is diminishing. Page 21, Bankers Association data for the number of branches in Manitoba. And you can see it's gone down over those, 3 or 4 years by the 10 in number, which is about 5.5%, give or take. Page 22 is the assessor's calculation. Page 24 is my calculation, driven by measured square footage, which I'll show you in a moment, actual rent in place, and a 7.5 cap. Page 25 is the rent roll, which is also found in the assessor's brief. And you see there the square footage of 4,495 and the rate of $16.38. Page 26 is the income statement. And you see that the income is $73,514. Of course, that doesn't account for vacancy or shortfall because it's an actual calculation. Page 27 and 28 are the certifications by the survey company that did this work. And again, I say 2 things about it. I acknowledge it appears to be done based from the interior of the walls. So I acknowledge that. But secondly, it's what the parties have agreed to. And I think we can't lose sight of that. And then page 29 and following through to the end of the brief is a series of articles. And you can see these go back in time, but the theme of these is that the number of branches is diminishing. The branches are shrinking. Page 32 is an article that goes back to 1999 about North End branches closing. Page 33 is an article that goes back to 2013, again about, among other things, branches closing. Page 36 is an article from 2017. The Canadian banks are expected to close dozens of branches. And then page 37 and following, it's all about technology. And reality is, and I think even I, who am not a technological marvel, even I now do some banking online. I deposit checks using my app. I think that's just the reality. And what that leads to is a need for fewer branches and a need for smaller branches. And the other thing that's happening is that banks, which historically had a vault in them and had facilities like that, they don't anymore. Banks don't always put vaults into their branches anymore, the new builds. So all of that is impacting size. All of that is impacting need. And so that's my presentation, and I'm now open to questions.
Thank you for that. Mr. Cupter, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few. Good afternoon, Mr. Newman.
Good afternoon.
This property has transacted twice within the last, say 7 years, 6-7 years prior to the reference date. And in both occasions, it transacted for a higher market value than what you have estimated for this assessment cycle. So I'm wondering how you reconcile your market value coming in lower than what the market value was determined by the sales in both 2016 and 2017.
So aside from the fact that the building is, let's call it 7 years older by now compared to those sales, but I don't think that's the important factor. I think what's important is that the world has changed, banking has changed, the demand for banking has changed, the configuration of banks has changed. And I just think that when you buy a property in 2017 with a lease with 9 or 10 years to run, that's one thing. When you're at April 1 of 23 with 3 and a bit years to run, but also the world having changed, I just think the real estate economy is dynamic, and to assume that just because a property sold for X on a certain day means that the value will never go below that, I don't think that's right. I think values do change over time, and there are many people who have paid a price for some real estate and later had to sell it for less. And so that's what I would say to you.
Okay, thank you. The rent that you've selected is the site-specific rent per square foot as reported on the INE, is that correct?
It is.
Have you done any analysis? Do you have any comparables? Can you speak to whether this is on the lower end or the higher end, or how this rent might fit into a larger market?
So I have comparables at page 3 of my brief. I have 3 branch comparables. Again, considering the level of space in the basement. So I think I chose the rent in place, but I think that rent in place is supported by the comparables on page 3 of my brief.
Okay, and the capitalization rate you determined to be 7.5%, is that correct?
It is.
And that's based on the Altus office study found later in your brief, is that right? I'm just searching for the page.
It's found on page, it's based on a number of things. It's found on page 10. It's based on a number of things. In part, it's the Altus information, but in part, it's also recognition that the model rate isn't going to be reflective of a lot of buildings, bank buildings with basement space or the percentage of space that this property has. And in my view, a property that has this volume of space in the basement, especially if you're going to treat it as office, and similarly, if you're going to treat it as retail, it becomes less attractive in the marketplace. And so those combination of things caused me to move the capitalization rate upwards.
Okay. So the capitalization rate is a factor of this analysis as well as your larger market analysis, and the rent is the site-specific rent, correct?
Supported by the market comparables, yes.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
Yes, I do have a question for you, Mr. Newman. I'm also looking at your page 3 rent comparables, Roblin, Ellis, and Marion. Do you have the ages of those properties?
So I can tell you Marion for sure is an older property. It's a small branch on Marion in St. Boniface. And my belief is it's 1960. The Roblin property, that's the Royal Bank. I don't think it's 50s or 60s. It's in a strip center on the south side of Roblin that I've driven by many times. I'm going to say to you that it's probably an 80s construction would be my guess. And then 1395 Ellis is out sort of into St. James. And again, it's going to be newer as well. It's not going to be a 50s or 60s construction.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Yes, just briefly about the basement square footage. You've said a number of times that it's 30% of the overall square footage.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, what is the condition of that, and what is it used for? Just storage, or is it finished?
Yeah, in my experience, basement space in buildings like this is frequently partially finished. Obviously, there'll be some mechanical down there. There'll be 2 sets of stairs, and actually, if you look at page 28, you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about in that regard. There will be some storage down there. Frequently, there is what I'll call a minimum level of finish. Floor might be tiled, might use it as a lunchroom down there, for example, simply because there isn't a lot of space on the main floor. So it'll get some minimal use, but it won't be what I'll call the main active space of the business that operates.
Okay. I think that is. And so, well, sorry, one more question about the measurements, because that seems to be an issue here. So can you confirm that the measurement that is put forward in your brief is interior measurements?
That certainly appears to be the case based on where the arrows are going. They're touching the interior of the walls.
Understood. All right. And thank you. That's it for me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. You're asking for 923,622.
Correct.
Would you normally round that to 924?
I would.
So we can do that then when we're considered property. Your rent is 1638. So the actual that came back for the net operating income was 73,510. You have 69,271.
That's correct.
Less than the actual, and you care to comment on that?
Yes. So obviously, when the building is occupied, as the subject is, there's no vacancy factor, there's no shortfall factor. And so those 2 elements, if you look at the calculation, you can see that the vacancy is $1,472. The shortfall is $719. So there's about $2,200 there, accounting for the difference. The rest of it is non-recoverables. Non-recoverables, in theory, you're always going to have potentially, but the difference really is the application of the formula, the income approach formula, which makes certain deductions in getting to net operating income. That creates the difference.
Page 27. with your diagram. I also think that the measurements are a critical issue. My question is, I'm not gonna go through these calculations right now, these measurements to check it, but my only question is, when the leasing area is calculated, do you include the openings there on the main floor? Or do you not include them?
Yeah, I truthfully, I don't know whether they have been included or not. Certainly, there are dimensions which give the impression that they have recognized the size of the openings and have done the measurements to enable them to be taken into account. Whether they've been so what I see is I'm looking at page 27. And what I see is what I'll call there's a dimension of 37.6 and there's a dimension of 83.6. And that creates 3,143.36 square feet. And based on that, I'm going to say to you, they've not taken out the openings. Because if you look at the margin of page 27, you can see they're showing the floor 01, as they call it, the main floor, as being 3,144 square feet. And when I multiply the 37.6 by the 83.6, I get 3,143.36. And that tells me that those openings, although the dimensions are there, have not been removed from the square footage.
Okay. And there's a little, little jog there on the left side that would add a little bit, okay. That's fair, that's close enough, yeah. Okay. And you had mentioned there are 4 issues: square footage, rent, vacancy cap. The vacancy, you have the same vacancy as the city, so it's you.
Yes, and I've really mentioned it only in the context of highlighting the issue that banks don't stay forever anymore. There's a lot of movement in the bank world through consolidation and closure, but I'm using the same vacancy allowance as the assessor.
I guess to get back to my question again about the measurements, what I really wanted to know actually is, what is the standard way to calculate the area that you're going to lease out for an owner? Is it interior or is it exterior?
So
Or
I think there are many different answers to that question. You may get different answers in a multi-tenant property as opposed to a single tenant property. And of course, sophisticated parties can always decide that by contract, they will determine the standard of measurement because they want a desired outcome. And so if you're a landlord badly trying to lease to a very good quality tenant who's going to pay you a lot of rent, and that tenant says, I want the square footage measured interior of the walls, you may well give way because you're motivated to get that tenant. On the other hand, if somebody badly wants your space, you may say to them, we're going to measure to the exterior of the walls, and they may agree to that because they're motivated to get into the space. So I can't give you, the answer is there are obviously different ways to do it. I don't think there is ultimately a single, only one correct way to do it.
Floor area, usable floor area is really what's important, correct? And the walls really aren't usable for anything, so that's my only comment.
Yes, and by the same token, some would say the openings aren't usable either, but of course they are usable because they create the access between the different floors, so they're necessary from that perspective. But clearly, in these circumstances, the bank understood what it was doing when it obtained these measurements, and this is what the landlord agreed to in terms of the square footage.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can we ask the assessor the same question about the standard of measurement?
Yes, that's a good idea. Mr.
Uh,
Kupfer,
Yeah,
you go ahead, ask the question. Yeah.
yeah, Mr. Kupfer, what is the standard in terms of the industry, in terms of other, property management companies, that sort of thing, the assessment department?
So my understanding is different provinces will have different standards for measurement. Within Manitoba, our standard is exterior measurements. So it means exterior wall to exterior wall. During the last hearing, I believe it was mentioned that the company performed these measurements were based in Ontario, where I think standards may be different. And beyond that, I would speak to equity. It's really at the heart of what we do. So by assessing all properties the same way, using exterior wall to exterior wall, it means we're assessing them in an equitable way. We simply can't accept a different form of measurement for certain properties over other properties, or we just won't be assessing these properties equitably.
And does the assessment department, is that consistent with other property management or other types of companies in Manitoba, leasing companies?
Yes, I believe it is.
If I could ask just one more question on that vein too. When we speak of real estate, or when we're in the market for real estate, when an agent gives us the square footage of the property that's for sale, that's the floor area, right? That we're purchasing. Is that now a different measurement than what it's being assessed at? Or, you know what I'm getting at? Like
Yeah, so
okay, go ahead, sorry.
they may indicate a usable floor area, which could be outside of the total floor area. But again, my understanding is in Manitoba, when representing the total square footage or the square footage of a property, of a building, the acceptable standard is exterior wall measurements.
And that goes for residential and commercial?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So when it's on a land, when there's a land title on a residential property, that's considered exterior measurements?
Yes, our residential properties as well, when we add them, when we measure them, they're done based on exterior measurements.
So your rebuttal is next, Mr. Kupfer.
So the rebuttal is it's short. It's simply a 2-page document, and it largely pertains to the capitalization rate. We've spoken a lot about bank capitalization rates. There isn't a large sample size, unfortunately, for banks specifically. I've indicated that they're generally seen as a subcategory of the office market. The office market is kind of the best indicator. But in the case of the subject property, we actually have a site-specific capitalization rate, which was calculated by the property owners at the time of purchase in 2017. And that's shown on page 2 of the rebuttal. And that was calculated to be 6% for this site. So I think that is the best indicator of capitalization rate going forward. Maybe there are some adjustments to be made based on, as Mr. Newman stated, how the world changes. But with a starting point of 6% capitalization rate, I simply don't see how the agent ended up getting to 7.5% for his analysis.
Can I be sent the rebuttal?
Yes, Mr. Newman, I'm just sending that to you right now.
Oh, my
Thank you.
apologies.
Thank you.
You can just give me a moment, Mr. Chair. Okay, I've just sent it.
Let us know when you have it, please, Mr. Newman.
I shall. It appears it's gone to Australia first. Okay, why don't we just, I think the assessor has perhaps given me a sense of what's there. Is it a questionnaire? Is that what it is?
It's the 2017 sale questionnaire pertaining to that sale. Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Newman, would you like me to get somebody else to send it just in case it's my computer?
Sure.
Okay, just a moment, please. Mr. Chair, can we take a short recess?
Okay, let's take a,
So I think.
yeah, let's take a short recess.
Okay, just.
We are back in order. Mr. Newman, would you like Mr. Cupper to repeat any of his points that he made on his report?
No, I have his points, and I don't know if he's finished. If he's finished, let him finish if he isn't, and then
Okay.
I'll just ask a couple of questions.
I think you were finished, right, Mr. Cupper? Yeah.
I believe I've made all my points. Yes.
Okay, so your opportunity to question then, Mr. Newman.
So I guess two questions. The second page of the questionnaire notes the interest rate is 3.61%. Do you consider that a very low interest rate for a commercial property?
I really don't have the data here to say whether it's high or low.
Okay. And do you think that low interest rate would have influenced the capitalization rate downward?
Again, I can't really say. I don't think I have the information to make that determination.
All right. And those are my questions. That's fine. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
No, it seems very clear to me. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you very much.
And I have no questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Kupfer?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
That will then conclude this item number 3, 739 Henderson. And we will move forward to item number 4, 2567 Main Street. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is file number 24-3556. The roll number is 0500-382-5600, and the street address is 2567 Main Street. The owner is a Manitoba Limited Company. This is an Assiniboine credit union. It's a newer build constructed in 2006 with a total leasable area of 4,470 square feet and quite a large land area, 28,062 square feet. And we have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $2,228,000 that I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Moving to page 2 of the brief, you'll note that we have no recent sales, unfortunately, on this property to compare to, and you can see an overhead view of the subject site. So this one is located right on the corner of Main Street and Red River Boulevard, so it has pretty good exposure there, I think, on that corner. And then to page 3, you can see the Google Street View photos of where the entrance here would be. So like I said, newer building, it looks newer as well. I believe it has those newer amenities like you'd expect for a bank credit union, such as the drive-through window, which I think you can see in the bottom picture on page 3. Page 4 of my brief, nothing new here. These are the, the rent comparables I've been showing all day for banks and credit unions throughout the city. Page 5 of my brief shows the income value workup. So again, 4,470 square feet. The model has a net rent selected here of just under $33 a foot. Everything here has been modeled, including the vacancy, expenses, and shortfall. And in this case, a lower capitalization rate, 6.25%. Again, I think reflective of that newer age of the improvement is how we derive our income value of $2,228,000. Page 6 of the brief shows the income value summary. Only one stream, one classification here, so that's all straightforward. Again, showing that modeled net operating income of just under $140,000. Page 7 of the brief shows our capitalization rate table, and page 8, the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts again. And then beginning on page 9 is the income and expense mailer for the subject property. So I note in this case, again, the tenant's Assiniboine Credit Union, the area that they list is the same that we use. And in this case, they have a reported net operating income of $158,543. So that is about $18,000 higher, actually, than what we have modeled in this case. And then beyond that, just some more information about the rent and the tenant there, Assiniboine Credit Union. So that's all the information I have on this property. So again, I'm going to recommend that 2025 assessment of $2,228,000 be confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Yes, just looking at page 9 for the moment, where you ended up. So you'll note that the indication that $525,000 of inducements were provided, and additionally a month's free rent was provided. I simply just want to have you acknowledge that's what the information that's presented is in terms of what the landlord provided.
I do see that on page 9. You're correct.
And so this is a 20-year lease, isn't it?
Yes, lease start 2005, lease expiry is 2026.
So if I take $525,000 and I divide it by 4,470 square feet, that's $117 a square foot. And if I divide that by 20 years, that means the landlord has given the tenant $5.87 a square foot. That's what the math indicates, correct?
I haven't done that math, but I'll take your word for it.
All right. So let's come back to page 1. You made note of the fact that there's a large land area of 28,062 square feet. Look at page 2 of your brief. So the orange lines are the boundary lines, correct?
Correct.
And so what we see is that a lot of that land that is in that 28,000 square feet, in fact, is roadways, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And the corner of Red River and Main Street, that's an area within which construction could not occur because of setback requirements, correct?
I don't have the specifics on what the setback would be. Certainly there would be one. I'm not sure what the footage would be.
Okay. And then, as you've noted, page 5, everything is model driven, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then your comparables on page 4. So the average is $30.76. The median is $30.50. Of those comparables, look at number 9, please. That's the highest rent, isn't it? $47.
Yes, it is.
And that's the Scotia Bank new 7 years ago, but that's the Scotia Bank branch on Taylor, correct?
Yes, sir.
Near to the old Manitoba Hydro building. And that branch came to be when Scotia closed a branch at Daly and Corden, and closed a branch at Corden and Waterloo. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of the ins and outs
Okay.
of that, no.
And this branch is actually on a pad site with the Walmart behind it, correct?
I'm not sure who the individual tenants are, but it notes on the income and expense mailer on my page 9 that 2567 Main Street is a freestanding building leased to the Assiniboine Credit Union. The building is part of the River Grove Shopping Center.
That's not my question, though. My question is asking you about the Bank of Nova Scotia on Taylor and whether it fronts onto a Walmart site.
Oh, I can't say with certainty.
All right.
I haven't reviewed that.
Okay. But without question, 2 of your comparables, number 9, 1100 Taylor, which we've just been speaking of, and number 11, 2840 Pembina, those are both north of $40 a square foot. Those are bringing your average and median rates up, aren't they?
As well as comparable number 8, which is also a $40 a foot rent on McPhillips.
Right. Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
I did have a question, and perhaps this was covered off, but maybe we can just go back because I obviously missed something. On page 10 of your brief, that shows a base rent for Assiniboine Credit Union. Can we figure out from that what the rent per square foot is? I've done math, but I don't know if I've done it right.
I'm showing that that amount corresponds to the base rent total under annual rent on page 9. So divided by the square footage would be 4,470 square feet. Be a rate of $35.25.
Okay, so I did do that right. Okay, and can we read from this that there's been other inducements involved in that amount per square foot?
There may be. We have a long-standing direction from the municipal board that tenant inducements and free rent are not things to be considered on our assessments.
Right.
So it's not something that I would factor in here.
Right. So but in that base rent that's showing of that $35, would we be able to tell if that would be reduced in any way?
Yeah, I believe Mr. Newman's calculations were correct. If you did take those things into account, then it would be reduced from roughly 35 to 30. But we're in the position that that's not isn't the way we'd proceed with it.
Okay, so I did miss that little bit that was talked about there. Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Kupfer.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Yes, just one. I'm looking at the map on your page 2. It just seems really odd. Are you sure that this is accurate? I say this only because the parking lot does not seem to be included in the lot dimensions, but these roadways that Mr. Newman pointed out, and a portion of the neighbor property, with a portion of their parking is included. So from where does the 28,000 square feet come from?
I believe that the lines are correct and that would equal out to the 28,000 square feet. My understanding is the Red River, saying this right, the River Grove Shopping Center would likely own this property as well as some others through their Manitoba Limited companies. So that might be why the lines aren't specifically around the building and where you might expect the property to be located.
Okay. Seems odd, but thank you for your explanation. That is all for me, sir.
Page 10 there again. So the total monthly revenue is 19,790, correct? Joe?
That's what it states, yes.
So if I multiply that by 12, would that give me the yearly revenue? Yes.
I'm not sure. I haven't done that calculation.
No, I'm just asking if I would do that, that would be the yearly revenue, correct?
Yes.
And so if I go the page up, then if I multiply it by 12, I get 237,480. And this is showing a base rent of 157,567. Just wondering if there is anything you can explain about that, or
You said I think maybe the discrepancy is in this year-end reconciliation of 13,959 with the total annual revenue. Should give you the correct figure.
all right, I missed that. There's a difference of 80,000, right? From the base rent shown on the page after.
That's correct. Base rent of 157,000 plus those recoverables, the CAM, property taxes, and management, minus that year-end reconciliation amount of just under $14,000. That's how they get to 222.
Okay, so this is total revenue then. Okay. Okay, I wanted to ask a question about that, but now it's kind of slipped. So where is this tenant inducements then? How is it captured in their yearly statement here? Those 525,000.
Well, it's listed on page 10 there. My understanding is these types of things would be applied over the length, either applied over the length of the lease or paid up front. I'm not sure how it was done in this calculation in particular, but as we've looked at both the base rent and the total monthly revenue, they'll correspond to what's shown on page 9 for what the owner's receiving.
Okay, so it's not shown in any of these expenses or anything. It's not shown there. It's just something separate.
Correct. It's not an operating expense.
Okay, I have no further questions. Mr. Newman, you may begin your presentation.
I think perhaps I'll begin where the questioning ended off, just to make things clear from my perspective. First of all, Mr. Kupfer says that the municipal board directs that we not consider inducements. And I agree that the municipal board says don't take the rents and don't discount them by the level of inducements. That still requires us, however, to look to the market to determine what the appropriate rent is. Because the difficulty is, of course, landlords don't give their money away. If they give a tenant $525,000, which calculates to $5.87 a square foot over the 20 years of the lease, and if they give the tenant a free month's rent as well on top of that, so it's actually going to be more than $5.87 a square foot, they expect to get that back. And how do they get it back? They get it back over the term of the lease. That's how they get it back. And so mathematically, you won't see in an income statement for a property a line that says base rent $30 a square foot minus $5 inducements, rent $25 a square foot. You'll never see that. What you see is what you see here. You see base rent on page 9 of $157,567. And we know that that's $13,130 a month when you divide it by 12. And we know that when we do the math, that $157,567 divided by 44.70 comes to $35.24 a square foot. We know all that. And I think the question was asked, would you take the $5.87 a square foot off that? Well, you might, just to see what the math looks like. That would get you to $29.37 a square foot. But again, as Mr. Kupfer says, the municipal board says that's not what we do. We don't enter into a process of subtracting the inducement level on a per square foot basis from the face rent or rent shown in the lease. But again, what we do have to do still is look to the market. And so that will then bring me back to the beginning of my brief. You can see on page 2 of my brief, I provide a variety of comparables of leases for banks. Goulet, November of 2022, RBC, $25 a square foot. Cambrian Credit Union, September of 21, $27 a square foot. The Marion property, older property, let's put it aside. 1375 McPhillips, 4,179 square feet, $25 a square foot. And again, there's a long list here, just as Mr. Kupfer has in his brief, a long list. And invariably, what you're going to find is bank rents can be a little bit all over the map. But what I'm going to say to you is those bank rents that are the highest, and if you think back to his comparables, they're the ones that are at the $40 plus range, and they're the ones that are part of shopping centers. They're the ones that are fronted by a Walmart. And as we noted, his median and average rates are $30.50 and $30.76. But of course, those are being brought up by the more newly constructed properties, in particular 1100 Taylor in 2018 and 2840 Pembina in 2017, both newly constructed, and those of course bring the rents up. So what I do ultimately is I look to the market and I select a rental rate of $29 a square foot for the subject property, looking at the spectrum of comparables I've noted, many of which are similar in size, some a little bit bigger, many of them below the $29 rate, but I've selected $29 a square foot. On the issue of vacancy, I'm not disagreeing ultimately with what the assessor has said in terms of 2%, but I am pointing out, as I did in the prior hearing, the bank world, the credit union world is fluid, it's dynamic, they're not there forever. branches turnover. Capitalization rate. I think it's too low. I'll have, and I'll jump you ahead because it's the same material you saw in the last brief, but I'll jump you ahead to page 15. At the bottom, first of all, the site has extremely limited parking. And one of the panel members asked about page 2 of the assessor's brief and where the boundary lines of the property are. And we have to remember the exercise we're involved in here. What would the willing buyer pay to the willing seller in the open market? So if I'm that willing buyer, if any one of you are that willing buyer who has come along to buy this property, what you're going to see is that on the property itself, there's not a lot of parking. If you were to look at the assessor's photo on page 2, and I've got the same photo on page 17. I'm sorry, I've jumped you around. I shouldn't have. Go to page 17 of my brief. So again, there you see the site. There you see the boundaries of the site. You actually see some parked cars on the subject property. And as you can see, there's not a lot of parking actually on the subject property. And what that means is you become dependent on an adjacent property. But if I'm buying the property and I have to be dependent on an adjacent property to supply me with sufficient parking, the quality of that property is not as good as a property which is large enough to support and stand on its own in terms of parking. So that's a risk factor from my perspective. As I say on page 16, again, you've got the issue of bank mergers, bank closures, consolidations. There's no longer an assurance that properties will stay for life. You know, in my view, this would fall again under an Altus analysis, but taking into account these other factors in the 7 to 7.5 range. I put it at 7%. I acknowledge that it's newer, but I say to you, it's still got, it's not perfect. It's still got some concerns from a parking perspective and from a stability of the rent. And so ultimately, my value is $1,750,000, driven by $29 rent, all the same assessor variables, which generates a net operating income of $122,000, which I then capitalize at 7%. Then in terms of the attachments, again, photo on page 17, the same banker's information on pages 18 through 21. Same series of articles about what's going on in the banking world, pages 24 through 49 of the brief. And that would be my submission, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you. Mr. Kupfer, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
Just a couple quick ones, thank you. Mr. Newman, you pointed out this is a 20-year lease signed by the Assiniboine Credit Union, correct?
Yes.
So that would have been signed shortly after or during the construction of the building, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So the Assiniboine Credit Union knew how much parking they would have and what the configuration of the property was when they signed this lease. There was no surprises for them, correct?
No surprises for them.
Okay. So they agreed that they would be able to operate, or they figured that they would be able to operate here, this size credit union, given the amount of parking that's available, correct?
Well, they agreed, but I think my point was that if I'm the buyer of the building, I'm going to be reliant on an adjacent property owner to secure additional parking. And in my mind, that creates an additional risk, and that leads to an adjustment to the capitalization rate.
Okay, thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
I
I have no questions. Thank you.
And I have no questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Kupfer?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Newman?
I'm good as well. Thank you all.
Okay, that then will conclude item number 4, 25
Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Main Street. Thank you very much.
Have a good afternoon, all.
You too.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Let's bring in the next
Yes,
applicant.
he just needs to show up. We've let him know that he's up, so. He says he's been watching. Oh, here he is. Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sorry, I was watching along on YouTube, but I realized there's a bit of a delay. So I apologize for keeping everyone waiting.
No worries. Okay, we will then proceed to item number 5 on the docket, 235 Marion. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation on this property.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is file number 24-3570.
Oh,
The roll.
excuse me, sorry. You must swear in the applicant.
Yes. All right. Mr. Applicant, would you please state your full name?
My name is Stephen Charlebois Page.
Thank you. Do you affirm that the evidence you are about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
My apologies, Mr. Kupfer. You may resume.
Okay, file number 24-3570. The roll number is 0607-501-5000, and the street address is 235 Marion Street. The owner is Doris P. Pinsky. This is a Scotia bank, another bank that we're dealing with. Original construction date is 1960. The leasable area is 2,241 square feet, and it's a smaller land area, 3,686 square feet. Everything is on one story, and we have a 2025 modeled assessment of $677,000, which I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. If you scroll to page 2 of my brief, you can see we have no recent sales for the subject property. You can see the property there located on the corner of Marion and Traverse. And then I think it's just 4 parking stalls available out back, and the remainder would be street parking. Page 3 of my brief shows some Google Street View photos of the subject property. You can see the bottom photo is a more recent photo. You can see the building's been painted black. Obviously, the Google van goes down Traverse less often than it goes down Marion. So the first photo is a bit of an older one, and the second photo is a bit of a newer one. That's why it looks a bit different there. Page 5 of my brief shows our rent comparables. Again, I would note that the subject property is on my rent comparables table as comparable number 7, where we've calculated a net rate of $18.74 for the site. And then moving to page 5, you can see the income value workup put out by our model. 2,241 square feet of leasable area. The rent was calculated at just over $22 a foot. Everything here was produced by our model, including all of our standard expense allowances, shortfall, and vacancy. And in this case, we're dealing with a capitalization rate of just under 7%. And that's how we derive our value of $677,000. Moving to page 6 of the brief, shows the income value summary. Again, one classification, one income stream, all pretty straightforward there, with a net operating income of $47,000. Page 7 and 8 of my brief show the capitalization rate table and the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Nothing really new to comment on there. And then beginning on page 9, in fact, it's just page 9, is the income and expenses that were submitted by the property owner. So you'll note that the NOI being reported is $41,000, $41,416. However, I'd also note that under the income line here, underneath the management fee, they show a previous year reconciliation of negative $7,700. I'm not fully sure if that's simply moving money from the previous year to the next, but that seems like it is impacting the net operating income being reported. Yeah, that's all the information I have on this property. So again, 2025 assessed value $677,000, which I believe should be confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Charlebois Page, do you have any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just a couple. So just confirm with you, the value presented today is model generated. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
Do you think that the actual rent in place represents a strong indicator of market value for this property?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So I noticed you noted the discrepancy there on the 7,700, and I won't begin to speculate what that could be, whether it's an appeal settlement and property tax and over accrual, what have you. It is noted there. But did you note that if you apply the typical vacancy, non-recoverable, and shortfall that the assessment authority has to these type of properties to that $42,000 and change they get in income, the value is, I guess, in line with the 41,000 net operating income on that statement. Would you say that's fair?
I haven't performed that calculation.
Okay. So I'll just get you to turn to page 7 of your brief, which is the capitalization rate study. I heard previously this being discussed, so I'll just keep this brief. On this chart, would you say that the model has looked at suburban B office for a property like this to lend to a cap rate?
Yeah, I think both the suburban A and B are largely our drivers for our bank type properties. Anything under suburban A and B would be 4 stories or less, which I believe all the banks we've discussed today are.
Okay. And then if I look there, I see that you guys have the range the city's provided, and then I look to the right and I see the 3 other outfits that you guys have highlighted. Is it fair to say that there's a range there between 6 and 8% in the two lines of suburban A and suburban B office? Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Do you think that the city being at 525 to 675 would represent an outlier given that range?
I think the 5.25, yes, represents an outlier from that range.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions at this time.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
I have no questions. Mr. Charlebois Page, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a single-story commercial building built in 1960. The subject property has a site area of 3,686 square feet. I will note that the leasable area at 2241 square feet is different than what's in my reconciliation. I think you guys have discussed this previous. It may have something to do with a difference between stairway and vertical protrusion measurement. I just have the original lease that measures 2,000 square feet for the 42,000 in gross income. So there is a discrepancy there, 2241 versus the 2,000. And the current assessment is 677,000 in the commercial class. I would direct everyone to page 11 of my report where I've produced my income valuation. The subject is leased out from 1 Feb 21 to March 31st, 2026 at a rate of $21 a square foot. Please note the discrepancy between my number and the assessor's brief, again, has to do with that 2,000 versus 2,300 or 2,241 square feet. The end result is the same. I think it's a rent of $42,000 as a PGI annually. I reviewed other comparables of ground floor commercial, and these would be a mix of retail and office tenancies. I think we've heard lots of discussion on the prior matters, but principally from my standpoint, I look at these properties and there's quite a few of them, the bank comparables that are located in anchored retail properties, non-anchored retail properties. So I think this is a fair data set to have a look at here on Marion to say, is the subject lease deal representing something in the market? In this case, it is. It's actually representing something in the higher end of the range, which is not atypical for banks. So I used the $21 lease deal in place, or for the sake of the GLA discrepancy, I'll say 42,000 as my PGI. I've applied a 2% non-recoverable, which is in line with what the city has. The $8 shortfall is in line with what the city has. 3% non-recoverable, also in line with what the city has. This area in the capitalization rate is where I will differ from the assessment authority. I've applied a 7.5% cap rate. And at this point, I'll just sort of echo the sentiments of the prior presenters in terms of the macro level considerations with rising interest rates. I've supplied a capitalization rate study. I won't dig into it, and I'll ask that the board just carries this forward to the next several properties. So the macro concerns of a changing game for retail, a changing game for business, where technology and modern standards have changed the need for. If you look at it like, oh, the major four banks want to service X area, and there's, X amount of customers in that area, so they need to, get an outfit in that area to service that. That calculation might have changed with a growing technological side of their business. I believe that's been touched on prior. Rising interest rates in both, and a changing economy for the office and retail properties. So I've included both studies, office and retail. I know the life after for different types of these assets could go either way. So I've given consideration to both. The good news is the range of those, let's call it 6.75 to 9.5 for suburban B office in our Altus study. And for what I would consider here to be retail standard quality is 7 to 7.5. I've applied at the bottom end of the range given the age and the limited parking at the back of this one, smaller lot. So I'm asking for a value of 528,000 rounded, and that concludes my evidence and presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Kupfer, any question on the applicant's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the capitalization rates, I see you've supplied the Altus Group retail and office capitalization rate study.
Yes.
Can you indicate if any of the properties that were studied were bank or credit unions, similar to what we're discussing today?
So as you sort of mentioned on a previous call, I don't think there'd be sufficient evidence to build a capitalization rate study, and standalone banks would be even more difficult. So no, there's no perfect indication of a cap rate. But in light of that, I would turn to the type of properties that this type of tenancy might transact in. So for the retail stuff, a number of those assets you've got on your list, I think they'd be contemplated. A tenant similarly, like an income stream similar to a bank, could be contemplated in sales of retail properties. So again, looking at that range of office and retail assets, saying, let's say 6.75 to 8.5, 7 to 7.5 for our retail study. I'm confident with the overlap between those two. The broker study showing 6 to 8%. I'm confident in the 7.5%.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No questions. Thank you very much.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
And I have no questions. Anything in summation, Mr. Cupfer?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Short Page?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that's a tongue twister. And I will just keep this brief. So the rents applied to the subject property are a little bit high given the actual deal. I think consideration should be given to the rent in place. And then on my capitalization rate, 7.5% seems fair and reflective of the market, given the range that the brokers are showing, given the range that the Alta studies are showing. So thank you.
That will bring to a close this item number 5, 235 Marion. Is anybody requiring a break? Excuse me. No. Okay. Carry on. Next property on the docket is item number 6, 1550 St. Mary's. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Cupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is file number 24-3788. The roll number is 08-005-052400. The street address is 1550 St. Mary's Road, and the owner is RJ Swan Motors Limited. This is again a commercial bank. This one's an RBC, constructed in 1988. Everything is on one story. We have a leasable area of 8,614 square feet, and it's a larger land area, 29,936 square feet. We have a 2025 model-driven assessment of $4,650,000, which I'm recommending be confirmed today. Page 2 of my brief shows an overhead view of the subject property. So it is right on the corner of St. Mary and Meadowwood, with good exposure along St. Mary. There are no recent sales for the subject history for us to compare to with our assessment here. And then page 3 of my brief shows some Google Street View photos that were taken. Shows that the exterior is being well maintained. It's not a 1988 finish, in my opinion. Like most banks, they tend to be fairly well updated and maintained. Page 4 of my brief shows the same rent comparables that you've been looking at all day today. Page 5 of my brief shows the income workup for the subject property. So again, 8,614 square feet. And we have a net rent in place by the model of $40.20. We have a 2% vacancy, 3% expenses, and $8 shortfall, as we have with all of our banks today. And in this case, capitalization rate of over 7%. In this case, 7.05% is how we're deriving our value of $4,650,000. Turning to page 6, shows our income value stream. Again, everything is one classification, one income stream, so that is all consistent and straightforward with what's shown on page 5. Nothing really new to say about the capitalization rate table or the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And then pages 9, 10, 11, and 12 are the income and expenses as submitted by the property owner. So we have this one calculated out to $32 a foot, or a net operating income of $262,000. And in this case, our model is deriving a higher net operating income than that. We're at $327,000, or about $40 a foot. So about a difference of $8 per foot in what's being modeled to what's being reported. However, I would reiterate that I think the capitalization rate for this property is being modeled also on the higher end at over 7% for a fairly new and well-located bank. So I think taking that in summation, I do believe that the actual estimated value here of $4,650,000 is a reasonable one, and I'm going to recommend that it be confirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Charlebois Page, any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few. So just to confirm again, today's value being presented is model generated?
Yes, sir, it is.
Do you, just directing your attention to page 6, I'll be flipping you between page 6 and page 9, everyone. So this is the income value summary page and the income and expense statement. So I guess my question bluntly is, would you agree that your PGI on page 6 of 346,283 is far exceeding the actual performance shown on page 9 of your brief?
Yes,
Which I
it
believe
is.
is 278. Okay. In following the same line of question, similar as the NOI there, 327,798 on page 6, far exceeds the 262,635 reported on page 9.
Yes, it does.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Also no questions, thank you.
No, I have no questions. Mr. Charlotte Page, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So here we have the single-story bank built in 1988. Site area 29,936 square feet. Leasable area 8614. Assessment is 4.723 million in the commercial class. I've provided an income value. My comparables start on page 11. Similar to the assessor here, I was unable to find commercial tenancies to sort of confirm the actual deal. I took a look at this. The subject properties included in my study, and I've looked at the citywide bank comps just to sort of confirm that the subject's lease deal is in line with those. It is. It's right there above the middle of that chart, at least the deals that I have. So for myself, I've applied a 2% vacancy, which is in line with the assessor, $8 shortfall, which is in line with the assessor, 3% non-recoverable. It's the same. The capitalization rate range, again, I won't get too into it. I'm actually 0.05% under where the assessment authority is. My range, again, there from both the studies I've put forward is 7 to 7.5 for standard retail, and then 6.75 to 9.5 for suburban Class B office. I did note the prominent location in the, I guess the new facing of the building in my consideration. So 7% is what I applied. In saying all that, if you flip to page 13 of my brief, I've got the subject property actual deal in place in there, the parameters that are in line with the assessment authority's current assessment, and I am seeking a value of $3,723,000 rounded downward, which concludes my evidence, my presentation. Thank you.
Mr. Kupfer, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
I noticed on the income and expense, they don't indicate the term of the lease, the length. Do you happen to know what that is for this this property?
So yes, based on the information I had a term of December 1st, 2022 to November 30th, 2027.
So 5-year lease?
Yeah, and you know what? For full transparency, I'm unsure if that's a 5-year within a 10 or a 15. But that's the information I had. That's the term for, I guess that'd be considered at the valuation date. So outside of that, I have nothing in addition to supply on that front.
Okay.
Just to be clear. Yeah.
Regarding the comparison of your cap rates from banks to office and retail, would you agree with me that in general, banks and credit unions tend to be sturdy tenants or more sturdy tenants as opposed to some retail, restaurant, or office tenants?
So I guess it's yes. So yes, I would say they are a strong tenant. I would also say that you can see similar rents from pad restaurants in, like, if you take a look at the comps at the top of your chart, those $40 guys, they'd be pad leases from prominent anchored and I guess enclosed malls, or anchored shopping centers at least. And I think you could see some comparisons only in rent. I wouldn't go ahead and say that they're comparable perfectly, but I'd say in rents they could achieve for those similar assets. Yeah, I could draw some comparisons between the two.
Okay. I guess my last question then is, if you have a tenant like a bank, like a credit union, who is pretty unlikely to break their lease, I mean, they invest a lot of money in these properties. Do you see a lower risk factor for a potential investor over potentially a retail tenant who might be more likely to have to shut down due to business operations or move out or break their lease early?
Sure. I think it's a difficult one, and I'll draw the parallel this way. If I have a small office space that I lease to a 25-year deal to the federal government, I might consider that to be pristine, and that's going nowhere. It's not disappearing in the night. The business isn't changing. That paycheck will that rent check will continue to come. Versus if I have a lesser tenant, you're right, that income's less secured. If I have a private person in there on a 3-year term, I would agree there's weakness within that lease for a prospective buyer. With this type of property here, the one thing that would draw concern is that you have these banks on a higher end rent here at $32 a square foot. And I have some other properties within my portfolio that I see, bank moves out and, the other major 4 banks are represented in that market and no one else needs that space for a financial institution. The life after for these assets, I do find that in my experience, it's more of a struggle to come in line with, I guess, an inferior tenancy or a lesser sort of quality tenant. So in contemplating a capitalization rate for income for a property like this, I think both sides of that need to be considered. But yes, they are considered to be an above average tenant. I would agree with you. But I think the $32 a square foot for 8,600 square feet in this case would, in my mind, about cover that. So.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
Okay, I might be a little cross-eyed after looking at all of these income statements, but maybe you can help me. On your page 13, you have that NOI at 260,653, but on the actual, the NOI is 262,635. Is there a reason you didn't use the actual, or am I just going cross-eyed and that could be the answer?
No, that's definitely not the answer. So what the difference is here is when you have a tenant like this, sometimes expenses can go directly to them, meaning like the hydro bill, you know what I mean? The account could be set up if you're a single tenancy. So here we're getting a report from the owner based on the tenant. And in my mind, it's a less fulsome picture than what I've done in my page 13 of my report. For this purpose, the city has modeled out, and I've used their modeled inputs in this case, the vacancy allowance, the shortfall, the non-recoverable for similar assets. And all that's doing is applying sort of a uniform rate to similar assets. And in my mind, it was better to follow that process, or at least more stabilized to follow that process, than to use what I consider to be, maybe something might be missing from that picture in the income and expense statement.
Okay,
So
good to
there you
know
go.
I'm not cross-eyed. Thank you for that. That is it.
So why didn't you use the 3236 contract rent then?
Mr. Chair, that's rent that's 3236. That's a bit of a confusion for me because there was a reported rent in the rent roll I have from the owner at $32 a square foot. And that's what I had the rent at. And that figure there was updated when I saw that, there was a discrepancy, but based on the rent roll I have, it was at $32 a square foot. So that's what I went with.
No further questions then? Anything in summation, Mr. Cupfer?
Nothing from me. Thank you.
Anything in summation, Mr. Charlotte Page?
I'll just have a brief one. I'll just say, I think the rest of the parameters here, I'm not taking dispute. They're in line with what I've reviewed. And I think the model's been way too aggressive at assigning a $40 square foot rent to a property that has an arm's length deal. close to the valuation date at $32 a square foot, I'd ask the board to consider that as the strongest piece of market evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will then conclude this item number 6, 1550 St. Mary's. We move on to our last property on the docket. Item number 7, 1188 Pembina. This is an application for revision of the amount of the assessed value. Mr. Kupfer, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is file number 24-3724. The roll number is 0309046600, and the street address is 1188 Pembina Highway. The owner of this property is Canadian Tire Properties, Inc., and the tenant is the Bank of Montreal. This is a one-story building constructed in 1956. It has a leasable area of 5,430 square feet. That's divided between the main floor and the basement space. And we have a 2025 assessment, again model driven, $1,205,000 that I'm going to recommend be confirmed today. Scrolling to page 2 of my brief, you'll see that we do have a recent sale for the property. This property transacted in October of 2019 with a declared, a sworn and considered value of $940,000. I've checked, it was Bank of Montreal prior to the sale and a Bank of Montreal after the sale, so there doesn't appear to have been any conversion here, but it was upgraded after the sale. I have included some permits later in my brief that we'll touch on. So this property is located on Pembina, on the corner of Pembina and North Drive. So we're looking south down Pembina here. The Google Street View photos on page 3 give you an idea of the exterior finish and the layout here of the bank. Page 4 of my brief shows the same rent comparable tables, same rent comparable table that I've been discussing throughout the day today. Page 5 of my brief shows the income value breakdown here. So as I stated, it's between the main floor and the basement. There's no second story here. So you have a total potential rent of $90,310 over the space with a leasable area of 5,430 square feet. Come out to a blended rate of $16.63. Again, everything here is model driven, the vacancy, expenses, and shortfall, as well as the capitalization rate, in this case, 7.05%, I believe the same as the last property, and a total estimated market value of $1,205,000. The income value stream on the next page, page 6 here. Again, it's all straightforward as there's only one classification and one income stream on the property. After that, we have our capitalization rate table and municipal assessment act excerpts. And then we come to the income and expenses supplied by the property owner. So they indicate a net lease in place. And then on page 11, they give a monthly breakdown of $12.72 on a net rate for that total space, encompassing both the main floor and the basement. And again, the tenant, Bank of Montreal. And beyond that, beginning on my page 13, I've included some information about the permit work, which was done shortly after the purchase of the property in 2019. Again, it's all interior work here, new partitions, redo the ceiling, millwork to be done in the space, and electrical work with an approximate declared construction value of $290,000 on top of the $940,000 sale price. That's all the information I have on this property. So again, we have a 2025 model-driven assessment of just over $1.2 million that I'm recommending be confirmed. Thank you.
Mr. Charlebois Page, any questions on the assessor's presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a few. I'll confirm that it was a model generated value put forward.
Yes, it was.
Thank you. I'll have you flip between page 5 and page 9, a similar exercise to the last property here. Does it concern you that the $90,310 PGI that you have on your property there, or your income valuation there, does it concern you that it's far exceeds the actual performance on page 9 at $67,750?
Yeah, I think by my calculation, our modeled rate is about $4 a foot higher than what's being reported.
But would you consider the fact that the 67,000 is inclusive of the basement? Would that also give you concern?
Well, no, our model assessment is also inclusive of the basement.
So the 90,000, so on a per square foot, that's disingenuous though, right? Because you're saying in your income value that 90,310 is the income this property could produce. The actual performance is showing 67,750. Is that correct?
That's correct. I don't see what's disingenuous about that.
Sorry, I just meant to say when you said the prime rent you're applying at $25 a square foot is tight to that figure. I was saying it's disingenuous because that 67,000 is encompassing of the basement and the main floor. And that's what I was trying to. I wasn't trying to say your rent was disingenuous. Sorry.
Okay.
My apologies.
Yes, and I provided the blended rate by our model at $16.63 when encompassing the main floor and the basement.
Okay, so that would be in more of a comparison to what we see on page 11 at $12.72 a square foot. Is that correct?
That's right, about a $4 discrepancy.
Okay, thank you. I'll just have you go to the cap rate portion of your brief there, page 7. We'll keep this brief again. I'll just confirm with you between Suburban A and Suburban B is the line items where the model would have selected a cap rate for this type of property.
That's correct.
Okay. I'll just ask you again briefly, 6 to 8% there. Is that a fair range that the 3 other outfits have described as a cap rate range for this type of property?
Yes, 6 to 8%.
And as you've indicated before, maybe I'll just ask you and confirm for this file, is the 525, I guess the low end of your guys' range, an outlier in your opinion from what the rest of the outfits are showing?
It is lower than what the other 3 outfits are displaying, yes.
Okay, thank you. And those are my questions. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, any questions?
I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
No questions, thank you.
I think you've explained the difference in the rent, so I won't ask that question again. Mr. Charlotte, what page you may begin your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a single tenanted single-story commercial building built in 1956, site area of 5,206 square feet, leasable area of, I guess there's a mix between the main floor and the basement. Main floor there is 3,080 above grade. The current assessment is $1,205,000 in the commercial class. I've selected the income approach to value and set the other 2 aside. There is an error in my brief. I would like to apologize. The subject property is no longer owner occupied. As Mr. Assessor noted, this property has a sale, and at which point I believe it was a sale leaseback. The subject property is leased $22 a square foot for the ground floor space, and there is a $0 consideration for the basement. I surveyed comparables along Pembina Highway here just to see if that sort of lease deal was in range or in line with the market. This will be a mix of ground floor, office and retail tenancies, not specifically financial institutions, but there is one in there at 1300 Pembina, which is in the assessor's chart and my comparable 10. The vacancy shortfall and non-recoverable will be in line with the current assessment, 2%, $8 per square foot, and 3% for the non-recoverable. For the reasons mentioned previously, I've surveyed both the retail and office. My range there is that 675 to 95. It's quite the bigger range when you come to the office. I've put it at the higher end of our range for standard quality retail assets at 7.5%. If you flip to page 12, my reconciliation of value is there. Please note the discrepancy between I've applied 22.45 a square foot, which is sort of in line with the comps there that I had on Pembina. I gave them maybe a little more weight. I mean, the subject property was leased in 2019. The market comps I looked at was 22.45. So in interest of being consistent, I went with the higher of those two figures. And my 7.5 capitalization rate there on a net NOI of 65,288. I am requesting a value of 870,000 rounded. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Kupfer, any questions on the applicant's presentation?
Just a few, thank you. You noted as well the 2019 sale. I believe it was $940,000, and that there may have been some sort of conditions around the sale. Can you speak to it at all?
I can't speak to specific details, but anytime a tenant sells the building, that may raise concern. Maybe actually a clarification from your end. Do you have this flagged as an arm's length transaction in your guys' system?
We do, yes.
Okay. Sorry, you can continue.
Well, my question was relating to your value and the sale price here. Of course, you use the income approach to derive your value.
Yep.
But would you consider the sale price, the nearly $300,000 of renovations that have gone into the property since then, as being inconsistent with the value that you've come up with using your income approach?
No, I think the sale of the property would have happened at an interest rate climate, which would have been much different than post-COVID and what we've seen up to the valuation date of April 1st, 2023. The investment world would have been substantially different. The market for commercial real estate, whether it be retail, whether it be office, whatever you consider this property to be, would be fundamentally different, in my opinion.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Nesbitt, any questions?
I do, Mr. Charlebois page. I'm sorry, I'm not following something on your page 12.
Okay.
It's with respect to your rent. So
Yeah.
you have the main floor, 3,100, 2245.
Correct.
You've not assigned a number to the basement,
Correct.
but then you have an overall rent of 1282. So is that what you're using, 1282?
So for simplicity's sake, I know that the blended rent is a preferred metric from the assessment authority. And in this case, my review of the actual income produced was they pay a prime rent on the main floor and nothing for the ground floor, or the basement, I should say, for the main floor, and pay nothing for the basement. That second figure simply shows that consideration was made for that. Like, that's the weighted basement rent. So if you were to go to the income and expense statement on page 11 of the assessor's brief, I know it's flipping back, they have it listed at $12.72 a square foot.
Right.
It's my understanding that the lease is actually $22 for the main, nothing for the basement, but
Okay.
just
So
two
that's
ways
what
of
you've done.
two ways of shaping what this property is. So
you've accounted for the basement space,
yes,
but not assigned a rent to it, but taking into account that 2245. I see what you've done. Okay.
correct.
Okay. And you've come up with that 1222, if you can just confirm, by looking at the income statement to see what was actually generated.
No. So sorry. I did look at the income statement and I did contemplate it, but it was a 2019 lease deal. So what I've done is I have actually relied, so I considered the subject property lease deal, but 2245 is the median of my data set on page 10 for those Pembina comps. And what I've done is I've assigned the higher of the two, given the fact that the lease deal from the subject property was 2019 at $22. And then I obviously looked at both to ensure that it was representative of market. And the subject property was at $12.72 a square foot is what they have on the income and expense statement. With the slightly higher 2245, I'm coming out to $12.82 a foot.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, all my questions have been asked. Anything in summation, Mr. Cupfer?
I have no need for summation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anything in summation, Mr. Charlotte Page?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it brief. I'll just say that it looks in this case, as it has been in the last two, the assessment authority and the model has overstated the assessed PGI in comparison to the actual, and what the market comparables are showing. So I would ask that the board adjust both the PGI and the capitalization rate to be in line with market. Thank you.
Okay, that will then conclude item number 7, 1188 Pembina, and we have heard all the items scheduled, and this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you,
you all.
everyone. Have a
a good
great
day.
day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
I will take us offline, Mr. Chair, and can we take a few minutes
Yeah,
to break?
I'm gonna
please?
take 10.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Let me know when we're
Yes,
offline.
I'll be right back.